Good evening and welcome to Heritage Hour. We've just got a couple more weeks left now of this season of talks. And this evening, I'd like to welcome Dr. Richard Pears, who's a local history expert and the secretary of the Wickham Local History Society, who's going to give us a talk about the history of Wickham, mines and mansions. So without further ado, away you go, Richard.
Thank you very much. Thank you for joining me, everyone. And thank you, Lucy and her colleagues, for organising this wonderful series of talks. I'm going to talk to you about Muck, mines and mansions. I've added the word muck there because I'm going to talk about farming and agriculture as well. And Wickham is a very, very old settlement, as I'll come to in just a moment. So I'm going to focus on a couple of things tonight about its agricultural role, and then the influence of coal mining, and then look at what is left of that influence, particularly some of the very substantial mansions that were constructed for those people who grew wealthy from the coal trade, and some of the housing and other buildings left and structures left from coal mining and industry within the Wickham area. When I say Wickham during this talk, I'm referring to the historical parish of Wickham, which is the area which covers the River Tyne on the north, so Dunstan and Swalwell, extending down the River Derwent on its west, so taking in Holland side and the Gibbside estate, the River Team on the right-hand side, so on the eastern side, south of Dunstan, down to Farnacres, small house now called Farnacres beside the Ravensworth estate, and then following the line of the Black Burn to form the boundary with Chesley Street Parish to its south. So this is the area I'm talking about. So it's essentially from the metro centre on the River Tyne down to the Gibbside estate, and including places like Marley Hill, Byermoor, Old Sunnyside, as well as the village of Wickham, which is the nucleus of the historical parish with its medieval parish church. And see some other places I'm going to mention on there, Holland side, Gibbside, obviously on the screen too. And Wickham is linked with the other parishes on either side. So Ryton parish, and you can see Winlayton on the hilltop on the left of the screen there to the west of Wickham, and Gateshead parish to the east on the right hand side of the screen across the River Team, and obviously Chesley Street and Lamesley to the south. So the prehistory of Wickham goes back a very, very long way. We know from the findings of stone tools like the stone hammer axe shown on the screen that people were in the area of what we now call Wickham from 2,000 or 3,000 years BC. And this is now in the Great North Museum, Hancock in Newcastle. On the end of a wooden shaft, this stone axe would have been used to clear trees, to remove forest and shrubland so that people could get wood for constructing shelters, for making fires, but also clearing the land for agriculture. And agriculture is a very important part of Wickham Parish. It is the one constant industry from prehistory through to the present day. It's still agriculture that gives Wickham village its semi-rural appearance as you drive into it from any of the major roads. So we have with artifacts like this stone hammer axe an indication that people were going to settle in this area. They were clearing the forest so they could plant crops, they could graze their animals. They were intending to stay. They were not nomadic people moving through. Even if they moved between several locations, they had cleared some space for agriculture and for accommodation in Wickham. And this was found at Washing Wells, an area to the east side of Wickham, beside the Black Burn, where near Watergate Park. And several other important aspects of Wickham's early history appear to be around the Washing Wells area. We have an indication a few centuries later of people with more sophisticated technology, a bronze spear found in the River Tyne. People are able now to use metalwork, bronze, to make spears, to make swords, to make some agricultural implements. And we know that these people presumably moved along the river as transport, because we have found artifacts like the log boat that you can see in the Discovery Museum in Newcastle, which was found in the mud by the river at Wrighton, but others were found in the 19th century along the river. So we know this is a hollowed out tree trunk. These people are moving along the river as well as moving over land. And once they're on the river, of course, they can engage in fishing and other and trade with other settlements around the river and further afield. So although we have a handful of artifacts, we get some sense of what people could do with these in terms of settlement and in terms of mobility and technology that they have at their disposal to make very ornate things. It's thought this bronze spear was deliberately put in the river as an offering to the gods. Several centuries later, we get some more evidence of people living on what is now Wickham, again close to washing wells and marshall lands on the eastern side of Wickham parish. And that's in the form of aerial photographs, which show the distinctive round circles of Iron Age roundhouses. So this is the period sort of 1000 BC up to the period of the Romans. And the round circle that you see in crop marks comes from this ditch, which is dug around the roundhouse so that water will run off the thatched roof and into a gully and then be taken away from the house. But essentially, it's one large room within an earth and timber and then thatched roof, possibly with a central fire, and then accommodation around the outside as well. So this is a reconstruction of one of these Iron Age roundhouses at Rydal Folk Museum. So again, these have been found at aerial photographs of these exist from marshall land and washing wells, but one was recently excavated close to Wickham Highway, near the Highlander Public House. So we know that this is the people were living permanently on the area that we now call Wickham. They may well have been living where Wickham Village is, but obviously evidence of that has been lost by successive generations living on the same site and building houses in different styles. So we have some idea of people living in Wickham very, very early period. And then into this world of people who were engaged in farming, both agriculture, arable and dairy farming. We have the foreign invaders, the Romans. And we have at Wickham crop marks, again at washing wells, of possibly two Roman forts superimposed upon one another at different periods. These were discovered by the Professor Norman McCord of Newcastle University in 1970, again using aerial photography. Today, there's very little to see, just the photograph at the top left, a fairly flat field. But the aerial photographs showed that there were these ditches of the Roman fort, and interestingly, the remains of the wooden gate posts where the gates would have been. So we have here a reconstruction of a Roman fort in the Midlands, the Lund Fort, where you have these wooden timber gateways set within an earth rampart with a ditch on the outside. And this is very much what we might see at Wickham in this period. Now, this fort has never been excavated, so we don't know how long the Romans were here or even when it was constructed. There don't appear to be any substantial buildings inside. We would certainly expect to see something like a granary if there were troops stationed here all of the time. And the fact that there are two forts superimposed on one another suggests that these might actually be marching camps or practice camps, possibly for troops heading north into what is now Scotland to extend the Roman Empire, but pausing either to camp here in leather tents. And we have on Trajan's column in Rome illustrations of the Roman army on active service where the troops stayed in leather tents within an earth and timber fort, or they may have been practicing their siegecraft and producing forts, making practice forts here. So it's possible what they had done was dig the ditches and the ramparts and build the gate towers, and then they perhaps lived inside temporarily in tents. So it seems unlikely that this is a permanent garrison fort, and this is almost certainly before the building of Hadrian's Wall in about AD 120, which really negated the need for a fort at Wickham. nothing is then heard of Wickham for several hundred years. The name is Anglo-Saxon. It means village with a quick set or a hawthorn hedge, ideal for keeping animals in and predators out. It's not really until 1183 that we have, with the Bolden Book, documentary evidence of people living in Wickham and some information about their lives and how they lived. And the Bolden Book was essentially a tax document compiled for the Bishop of Durham, who was the lord of the manor, and he had many rights: the right to raise an army to repel the Scots, his own coinage, he had his own courts, and he was the lord of the manor of much of Durham and parts of Northumberland, and certainly lord of the manor at Wickham. And so this tax document, the Bolden Book, tells us that in Wickham there are 45 villeins, or heads of families. Now, of course, that's 45 families spread out across that large area I've talked about, the historical parish there. And they each hold about 15 acres of land, and they pay 16 pence for that. And they also have to provide goods to feed the bishop. So a hen and 10 eggs. They have to pay rent on any corn that they grow. They have to pay animals, cows, to feed the bishop as well. And as well as farming the fields which they are paying the bishop to work on, they also have to work 3 days a week for the bishop. So bishop is taking a huge chunk of their daily life and their produce. And extra days in the autumn, when it was the time for the harvest, when all the household except the housewife was supposed to be involved. And because the bishop was moving around between one castle or palace, and he owned lands in Bedlingtonshire and Holy Island and Nottinghamshire in Northumberland, the people of Wickham were expected to carry his goods from Gateshead to Durham, or from Gateshead to Bedlington. And more importantly, it also gives us a sense of what kind of house these people lived in, because it says in the Bolden Book, each year the villagers had to build a house 40 feet long by 15 feet wide. So again, from the Rydale Folk Museum in North Yorkshire, we have these two recreations of houses of those sort of dimensions. And essentially they're long houses. The extended family would live in one part of it. Animals might live in the downside of the house. So the animals would be there, keep them under cover, but also their bodily warmth would help. And again, you would have a hearth in the center of the house to give warmth for cooking. But most of the time, as we see from the duties that the bishop expected of them, the people will be out working in the fields and trying to subsist. This was really subsistence, existence, wondering from one year to the next whether you would survive, whether you've grown enough food, whether your family would survive, or whether you would starve. So this is not some rural ideal. This is a very harsh situation in which to live, and it would be anyway. But the bishop is taking a lot of what you do. And the other churchman who is making a living from your produce, of course, was the rector of Wickham, who the priest in charge of the church, who also expected a tithe or a tenth of the villagers' produce. In Wickham, there is still a tithe barn, the remains of it, which I'll come to shortly as well. So the church exacted huge fees from people, both in terms of work, but also in terms of what they could produce. But we get some sense this is an agricultural community spread out across that large area of the parish, living in possibly stone, but more likely timber and thatched houses. And this is really the situation until about 150 years ago. If you look at the tithe map of Wickham Parish from 1842, we have Wickham Village in the centre here, and the church is in the centre of the village, but it's really surrounded by fields. This is very much an agricultural community still. The windmill in the park is there, but there are then small farms like Tethercock Farm on what is now Broom Lane, Wickham Southfield Farm over here, Dunstan Hill further over here, Wickham Grange. But these are interspersed between a lot of agricultural land. And this is land that has been expanded by enclosing land that was fell and moorland and turning it into agricultural land. Now, at the centre of that village, there would have been a village green. There is a village green in Wickham, but it's very, very small now. It really would have run from the area of what we call the Cross, where Langjack's statue is, beside the Crown Public House, all the way along to the bottom of Broom Lane, and would have been approximately oval shape. And on either side of that, there would have been rows of houses. So on the northern side, there would be the row with the church and where the rectory is today, and also a set of houses running along here. And then on the south side, another row of houses on the slightly higher ground overlooking the village green. And then the road from Hexham to Gateshead running through the centre of the village. There's also some clues in some of the boundaries that are still there today. There's a path, for example, that runs behind the church through the middle of the cemetery at the churchyard and continues along Orchard Road along here. And on the opposite side, there is a boundary clearly visible on this map between the houses that were in what's now Chase Park and continuing along beyond the rectory as it later became over here. And what I think this is showing is the land that belonged to the villagers, and then beyond that, the common fields that they were expected to farm for themselves, but also on behalf of the bishop and the rector of Wickham. And if we compare this with a medieval village plan, this is Warren Percy in Yorkshire, you get a sense of what I think we would have had in Wickham. A green in the centre with a road running through it, the villagers' houses, and then some land behind, some garths behind where they could grow their own vegetables or perhaps keep some animals, pigs or hens. And then beyond that, you have the common fields where they would spend much of their time labouring to subsist as well as they could. And obviously the church here is part of one of these rows, and there's a manor house. There was a manor house part of the row as well, and the mill too. So I think that's what we have in Wickham. So what happened to that? Well, the row on the north side where the church is still fairly distinguishable of Church Chair and School Lane in running either side of the church. On the south side, the houses have completely disappeared into what is now Chase Park. But this is where they perhaps would have been on that south side of the village overlooking the village green. Today, this is what is left of the village green, a very, very small postage stamp of very fine, beautifully maintained with beautiful flowers. But it is really a very, very small area compared to the village green that would have been there for the medieval villagers. And the village green was the centre of life. This is where fairs took place, markets took place, public executions unfortunately took place here. There's records in 1569 of 2 men being executed on the village green at Wickham for supporting the rebellion of the Earls of Northumberland and Westmoreland against Queen Elizabeth I. And in the 19th century and early 20th century, the Hoppings was here on the village green. And then it was used as a school playground for the parochial school. It was used as a car park. And then after the Second World War, it was restored as an ornamental green for the centre of the village. But the green and the church are really the two reminders of that agricultural village that is written about in the Bolden Book. What happened to the rest of the green? Well, it was built over. These houses here, pubs like the Crown, the others, they are all built upon the common land of the village green. And some large houses also took substantial parts of the common lands and turned the land around them into private gardens. But the church is there as a reminder of this early village. The church itself, the early parts are Norman and run through to the 14th century, and then a very large Victorian extension on the opposite side and rewindowed then. But the church tower is about 1360, the south aisle probably about 1340. So a reminder of this very, very early village and the people who've worshipped there and their successors who've worshipped there for centuries. So there are some reminders of this agriculture. As I said, if you drive into Wickham along any of the major roads, whether from Sunnyside or from coming up Wickham Bank, from Swarwell, or coming along with the highway from Dunstan, Wickham Highway, again, you're passing farmland, and it's a reminder Wickham is still very much surrounded by agriculture. There is a building called the Tithe Barn, much rebuilt at the end of Church Chair when it would have been close to the medieval rectory. There's a farm called Dunstan West Farm, built about 1809 for the cars of Dunstan Hill House. And it's a reminder that even until the mid 20th century, there were 3 farms on Wickham Front Street: Dunstan Hill at the east end, Dunstan West at the east end, and the Glebe farmhouse over towards the west end, where there's now some older people's accommodation over here, and also beside Langjack's statue, the building that is now the bank and the dentist's was originally the Cross farmhouse. So, agriculture was there throughout Wickham's history. And we also have a reminder of, in this agricultural community, with the windmill in Chase Park. The current windmill dates from about 1720, but possibly stands on the site of earlier windmills. We know from the Bolden Book there were mills in Wickham Parish. They may have been water mills along the River Derwent and Teme and the River Tyne, but it's possible there were some windmills as well. All the mills were owned by the bishop. The villagers had to pay the bishop to mill their corn into flour as well. So the bishop won all the time. He got money whatever the villagers tried to do. So this rural situation continues, as you can see from the tithe map of 1840, into a relatively recent period of agriculture being important to Wickham. But it begins to change in the 16th century, and that is because the use of a material that has probably been known to exist in Wickham since Roman times, coal. And it was described to Queen Elizabeth at the end of the 16th century that your township of Wickham stands on a mountain of coal. Essentially, much of the hill on which Wickham stands is coal deposits, coal seams. And this has been excavated for many hundreds of years. It's possible the Romans were able to take some of this because the coal outcrops were visible on the bank down towards Swalwell and Dunstan and could easily be dug into to extract more sort of drift mines or adits. Others began digging down through the soil to try and find coal. We have the first reference to coal mine in 1347, but that is probably recognized as a situation that's been going on for many years before. By 1520s, when Cardinal Wolsey, Henry VIII's chief minister, was Bishop of Durham, he received a letter telling him how much was being produced in Wickham Parish. This is Wickham Parish, not the rest of Tyneside, which was about 17,000 tons a year, which is quite incredible when you think this is being hacked out with, hand tools, essentially. A major change, though, came in 1582. This is when Queen Elizabeth, who, like her father Henry VIII, had been trying to limit the power of the aristocracy and also the bishops and emphasize royal power, persuaded or extorted, depending on your viewpoint, the lease of all the coal mines in Wickham Parish from the Bishop of Durham. And she did that because the bishop had been trying to control the amount of coal being produced. The coal was being exported to London. Elizabeth and her ministers wanted that to be available, more coal to be available, to provide more heating in London and provide more fuel for forges and industry. And so she was persuaded by a group of Newcastle merchants who could see the potential of Wickham Parish to give a grand lease of all the mines in Wickham Parish to this group of Newcastle businessmen. And we see the impact of that more business-minded and industrialized mining that took place, because by 1594, nearly 40,000 tons a year were being extracted from Wickham Parish. And this is not just on the hillsides, this is people starting to dig deeper and deeper to find coal underground. We know 1640, the Battle of Newburn between the Royalists and the Scottish army supporting Parliament. When the Royalist troops fled after their defeat at Newburn, they set fire to their tents on the hillside at Wickham. This ignited coal seams, and these were said to have burned for many years afterwards. Very similar to what happened at Watergate Colliery, if you can remember, well into the 1990s, of underground fires taking place. Then in 1650, there's a couple of very interesting references in the Wickham parish registers to people who are killed on the wagon way. Because for most the period previous to this, the coal has been dug out of the ground and put on sacks and carried by ponies, or put on sledges that are pulled by ponies or oxen along. And this is devastating for people who are trying to grow crops, because it's more important to get the coal out. The people who want the coal are much wealthier than the people who are trying to farm the land. There's a lot of complaints to the Bishop of Durham about the destruction of agricultural land by people engaged in coal mining, but he can't do anything about it because the Queen and the King later on are more interested in the taxes they're getting from the coal mining magnates in Newcastle. But in 1650, these references show that we have wooden wagon ways, a much more efficient way of getting the coal down, essentially down to the River Tyne at Dunstan and at Swalwell, from which it can be put on keels, barges to take it along to Newcastle, from where it can be exported. And so here we know we've got wooden railways, enormously expensive, tremendous infrastructure required to maintain these. So much so that it's been argued by two historians, David Levine and Keith Wrightson, that at this point in time, Wickham was an industrial community, because so many of the people in the village and the parish were engaged in coal mining, either mining directly or carpenters and joiners producing the wagonways and tools, smiths producing tools, people feeding the mining workforce. So a very interesting view on industrial revolution here in Wickham Parish. And then in 1726, several of the major families who were involved in coal mining, names very familiar to anyone who knows their northeast history, the Bowes family of Gibbside and Streatham in Durham, the Liddles of Ravensworth Castle, the Montagues of Denton, the Ords of Fenham. These families got together to form a grand alliance where they bought the lease of the coal mines in Wickham and began building wagonways and building ships to move the coal down to London, and really emphasize the industrial nature of what they were trying to do, extracting more and more coal from Wickham. And as the seams closer to the river became exhausted and within Wickham Parish became exhausted, moving further south towards Marley Hill and Byermoor and Tanfield and Blackburn, as we see on the map here. And in Ravensworth Castle Park itself, the Liddles had their own coal mines there. And so this map from 1951 shows that transition from coal mines near the river to still functioning coal mines further out at the southern end of Wickham Parish. Going back to 1590, in Alnwick Castle, there is this very interesting map, very naive in many ways, but it's not really showing the topography. What it's doing is showing where the coal is. This is a map for Queen Elizabeth I. So we have Newcastle within its walls over here, and we have Benwell and Elsick and Winlayton here and Wrighton, but we have Wickham down here. And what this shows is each black dot is a colliery, and it's showing Wickham has the largest concentration of collieries, and it's showing down at the riverside piles of coal waiting on jetties by the river Derwent here to be put on these coal barges, these keels, and taken down the river to Newcastle, and then put on larger ships to be taken out for export. So this is showing Wickham is the centre of coal mining, not just in Britain, but in the known world. And this is why it's vital that Elizabeth supports these Newcastle merchants in extracting as much coal as possible from Wickham Parish. And some idea of how they did this. Well, essentially what are called bell pits. People would dig down through the land and then find where there was coal seam, and then they would hack away at it with a pick, put it into corves or baskets, and then it would be hauled up to the surface, and they could then be put either on sacks, on horses or donkeys, or later on onto coal wagons. Very dangerous way to operate. You could dig for as long as it was safe to do so, but there are many instances in the parishes of Wickham of people who were killed in a pit because they dug too far either side and the ground above them collapsed. But we know that by the middle of the 17th century, some of these pits were over 100 feet deep. So this is major engineering here, with the walls of the pit braced with timber to prevent them closing in on the people and collapsing. But these are all over Wickham Parish. You can see them in Lottie's Wood. You can see them below Dunstan Hill Hospital. You can see them opposite the stables on Dunstan Highway, and all down the bank along the Banky Fields towards Swall and the Metro Centre. Today they were just covered over. The tops were covered over, not even infilled, and so in shallow light you can see these saucer-shaped depressions in the ground that indicate that this is where these bell pits were dug, and literally hundreds of them must be around Wickham. And we get some sense of what this was like. What they did was to put the coal onto the backs of donkeys. Later on, they used coal wagons. And so we have this image from the 18th century. This is at Gateshead, where we have the wagonway coming down beside Redheugh, the man riding on the back of the coal wagon that's full, the pony trotting behind. He's leaning on the brake to try and brake it as it comes down the hill. And it gets to the bottom of the hill, and then it's tipped into a pile within this coal stave here. Notice it's covered because they don't want the coal to get wet. They don't want it damp. That loses its value. So we have these huge structures, coal staves constructed to keep the coal dry. And then keels come up alongside, and the coal is then wheelbarrowed into the keels to be taken down the river. And meanwhile, the empty cart is pulled back up the hill by the pony to go and collect another load. And then the refinement, of course, that later on is the introduction of steam locomotives, as we see here, this image from Beamish, to pull the coal wagons along. Some idea of the assault on the senses that must have occurred visiting Wickham or Tyneside at the time comes from Celia Fiennes in 1698, where she says, "As I came near to Newcastle, I saw abundance of little carriages with a yoke of oxen and a pair of horses together, which is how they convey the coals from the pits to barges on the river. The country is full of coal. The sulphur of it taints the air and it smells strongly. On a high hill 2 miles from Newcastle, I could see all about the country, which was full of coal pits." So she'd been shown around these coal pits because the owners were very proud of this engineering endeavour that they were doing. But she gives us a sense of the destruction of the landscape and also the smell of coal in the air. And some idea of the amounts. Exports from the Tyne, from all of the Tyne collieries, were 700,000 tonnes in 1720, 1.6 million by the end of that century. And Judith Milbank wrote, over 48,000 people employed in the coal trade on Tyneside in 1778. But a very, very expensive business, one that could lose a fortune if water got into the colliery. So very elaborate systems of drainage were introduced, using water mills to drain the collieries as they had to go deeper and deeper. So this innovation of rail transport is one that revolutionized the industry because of the ability to move coal in larger amounts, but also from further afield, further away from the river. The goal was always to reach a navigable river, whether that's the River Tyne or the River Wear. And here we have a map from 1714, which actually goes all the way from the River Tyne at Swalwell up to Tanfield. It's the Tanfield Railway. And this is the last part, which shows the railways coming down the hill, coming into Swalwell town. There's Swalwell, River Derwent here. And some of them coming into where the Crowley factory was, others continuing along the wagonway, crossing the River Derwent by a bridge. You can see that it says bridge, and then continuing along to several where it branches out so that the coal can be taken to several jetties or staves at the same time, so they can maximize the loading of coal onto barges, onto keels to be taken down the River Tyne. But the engineering behind this is quite phenomenal, to create level ground on which the wagonway can run, constantly maintaining the wooden wagon wheels because the wooden wagon wheels and the wooden rails because they split, and keeping them wet so that they didn't burn. So this is huge engineering required. And we get some sense of the names. So here we have Sir James Clavering being named here, Clavering Park, later Axwell Park over here as well. Roger Anderson, the Andersons of over towards Brighton, owning the house over there, Bradley Hall. And this is Wickham down here. Again, Clavering owns land on both sides. The railway is running through his land on both parts down here. And some of the innovations that came about, we have the first railway bridge in the world, Causey Arch, on the Tanfield Railway, built in 1726. What many people don't realize is the arch is a stupendous piece of engineering, but so too is the artificial hill that was built on the opposite side of the burn to create a level to bridge with the arch. So huge, millions of tons of earth and rock, and the river culverted to allow the bridge to be built and the embankment to be built as well. Wooden wagons like this were the staple of it, standing on these wooden rails to take the coal from further and further away from the river down to Dunstan and to Swalwell. Or down, here's a picture of the team stair again, this enormous covered structure to keep the coal dry while it's waiting to be put into the keels. And of this great industry that employed thousands and thousands of people until the 20th century, there is very little left today within Wickham Parish. Within Wickham, there was Axwell Park Colliery on Swalwell Bank, which ran from 1839 to 1954. And the structures were there on the bank side as you came up from Swalwell. Colliery Yard, looking across to the houses of Eleanor Terrace over here. And this is a view, this part is still recognizable today, but where the garage is now, the National Garage is now a nursing home, and there's another block of flats here as well. But this accommodation, Eleanor, Edith, William, George, James Street, these were all accommodation houses built for the families of the miners of Axwell Park Colliery in the 19th century. On the east side of Wickham, Watergate Colliery flourished from 1920 to 1964. And here we have some images of the railway coming out from the mine to the screens passage, the headgear over here. Here's a plan of it from 1930 by a man called H. Beavis, which shows the screen passage with the railway lines coming out of the ground, as we've shown here, the locomotion shed, and then the offices and shops, the fans, the Garth shaft over here, for people to go down, the men to go down and boys to go down to the mine, the stone breaker over here, and things like the ambulance and the camp room over here, and the explosive store as well. So we have an image of what this looked like from maps and a few photographs, whilst today it's completely disappeared. That underground fire was eventually put out by Gateshead Council, and the whole of this has been landscaped as a very beautiful park, Watergate Park, and much enjoyed by the people of Wickham and surrounding area today. And of course by the wildlife that now lives in what had been a fairly grim situation before. These collieries existed throughout Wickham Parish. So to the south of Wickham Parish, Andrews House Colliery at Marley Hill from 1840 to 1920. And this picture, I think, is wonderfully evocative of just how difficult and gritty and raw life must have been for these villages out on the fells of Wickham and other places. We have chimneys of the cokeworks here. We have the miners' cottages in rows extending. There's another chimney just visible at the bank of the hill over there. You've got the head of the drift here, and you've got the two Methodist chapels, because again, the Church of England tended to stay in its established parish churches. The Methodists went to where the people were, and so you have both primitive and Wesleyan Methodist chapels, even in a fairly small colliery settlement like Andrews House, which has pretty much disappeared entirely now. Marley Hill had a cokeworks, terribly dirty, polluting environment. Molly Hill Colliery closed in 1983, and this is a photograph taken by Jack Metcalfe of Wickham in 1984, which again gives some idea. The headgear is still there, some of the colliery buildings are still there, but just the amount of rubbish and poor quality coal and ash and stone and rubbish just thrown to one side. And again, all of this across the county of Durham has been cleaned away to give us green land again and parks. One of the most obvious signs of the coal industry was the Derwenthof Coke Works. Again, this is a beautifully evocative picture by Jack Metcalfe from 1984, where the sun is almost blotted out over here by the smoke and the filth coming from the Derwenthof Coke Works. Today, again, after reclamation of that poisoned landscape, we have a beautiful park, Derwenthof Park, with this lake, the remains of the early Crowley ironworks and the dam there have been exposed to view, and you've got birds like the heron down here, the swans, a beautiful place coming out of that absolutely appalling industrial landscape. Norwood end of the Team Valley, the north end of the Team Valley, again, huge coke works. These poor people trying to clean their washing with this utter filth coming out of there. Again, has now been reclaimed as hotels and shops and factories at the end of the Team Valley. But again, was there within living memory. Swarwell itself was, Wickham remained very much a sort of rural part of the parish. Swarwell and Dunstan were the more industrial parts of Wickham Parish. And we see this map from 1802, the site of a very famous industry, Ambrose Crowley's Ironworks. Ambrose Crowley, a Quaker ironmaster, came from London and set up first at Sunderland and then later in Winlayton Mill in Swarwell, his ironworks, powered by water. So we've got the River Derwent over here, and we've got a dam pool, the dam and the pool down here, for the works at Swarwell, and there was another one for where I showed you for the Derwenthof Park, and the island that's created essentially, where the mills are powered by water running either side of it, and we again have barges carrying the goods out to the River Tyne, off to the right hand side of the map. Here's another plan of it in the 1830s, where it's now been taken over by the Claverings. But again, you have the mill race either side of the factory and heading out towards the river over here. So this is all the factories that once existed down on that site, where Lidl is today, in Swarwell. And again, Lidl paid for the restoration of the chimney that survived from the site, and there's a few of the industrial buildings nearby as well, but again, very little. The mill race survives, part of the mill race survives in a private garden at the bottom of Swarwell Bank. But actually, if we go back to that 1842 tithe map, even those factories and that industry at Swarwell was set within a rural landscape. So the mill dam that I showed you on the picture previously is here, and this area is where the factory was, set in the beside the river. But again, this is the road from Wickham, the bank coming down here, all agricultural land, and a handful of houses. And Swarwell village itself essentially is clustered around the road on either side of the factory, and a little bit over this way as well, along the road either side of the waterway past the factory. So Swarwell had the industry, but again, it's very much set within this rural landscape. And if we turn to Dunstan in 1842, again we see Dunstan really optimized as a place for where the coal can be put onto barges and taken onto ships and taken for export. And we have the remains on this map, remains of wagonways shown, cutting through here again, like the one I showed you at Swarwell, but here's a one at Dunstan, branching into several arms so that they could maximize loading at the riverside. And we have here coal staiths on the riverbank. We have coal staiths over here. This is before the construction of the coal staiths out in the river, which allowed larger ships to dock alongside and gather more coal in one go. But Dunstan itself is really a ribbon of buildings along the riverside. Really, the people are there to serve the coal works, the coal staiths, and some of the other industries that sprung up, like chemical and iron works along here. Occasionally you spot the odd mill down here, perhaps not for corn anymore, maybe for grinding glass or for metalworking. But again, behind that, Wickham Thorns is still there. This is sort of Market Lane coming along here. So again, very, very rural landscape beyond that industrial fringe along the riverside. So all of this today, of course, is now completely built over by modern Dunstan. And here's just a picture of what I was showing there. So the coal staiths that were built out into the river at Swarwell and at Dunstan enabled larger ships to tie up on both sides, in the lagoon on one side and on the riverside, and the coal could be dropped directly into their holds from there. So again, maximizing export of coal from the River Tyne. And other industries sprang up at Dunstan. So we have the Cooperative Wholesale Society with its flour mills and its soap works. Again, coal provided the fuel for a whole range of other industries. Chemicals, ironworking was one of the reasons Crowley came to Swarwell and Winlayton Mill, was the good quality coal available from Wickham Parish to support his metalworking. So here we have the soap works and the flour mill. Here we have the ladies at work within the Cooperative Wholesale Society soap works. A wonderful picture of the women at work there, with just one or two men working alongside them. And then this remarkable picture, this is the CWS Fire Brigade at the Dunstan Flour Mill, because flour factories were prone to explosion with the dust in the air, so they needed their own fire brigade on hand. So wonderful picture from Beamish of the CWS Fire Brigade at Dunstan. And of course, Dunstan continued into the 20th century as the industrial part of Wickham Parish, with the power station being constructed there and used to power much of Tyneside from this one power station. I've mentioned the co-op there, and in the villages, the co-op was a really important part of village life. So in Wickham, Wickham didn't have its own cooperative society. It had a branch of Townley near Consett Cooperative Society, and also the Swarwell Cooperative Society. And the building, the Wickham branch of the Swarwell Cooperative Society, is still there. It's now the Chinese takeaway and the hairdressers. But you can see on this plan, it was originally built to be two parts of the co-op store. There were co-ops also in Swarwell and in Sunnyside. Dunstan had co-ops and had shops as well. And Dunstan Swarwell also had what Wickham didn't. They had trams and they had railway stations. Wickham on the top of the hill never had trams or trains, but certainly Dunstan Swarwell still have stations, and they had trams as well to enable people not just to work locally, but also to work in Newcastle, in Gateshead, or further afield. So this Wickham Parish, Dunstan Swarwell, becoming in the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, part of this much larger Tyneside conurbation, with people working across the area rather than locally. We do have in Wickham a very fine example of a very early garage for the motor car. Some of the people in Wickham who lived in the very big houses, very wealthy enough to own a motor car. Indeed, there's a reference to a fatal accident in 1914 with one of the owners of a car of one of the big houses in Wickham. And so cars needed petrol, and we have here what is now the garage Wickham on Wickham Front Street, bottom of Broom Lane, was originally this very interesting Chinese style design, very ornamental with the shrubs in front as well. many of the streets of Wickham Parish, the settlements within Wickham Parish, have undergone quite radical change in the 20th century to try and bring more modern shops into them. So this is Wickham Front Street in the early 1970s, Curry's shop, electrical shop, you can see there. But essentially houses of 18th and 19th century form along the village, some of which are shops as well. In Wickham, that was demolished in the 1970s in 2 phases to create a modern shopping centre with Lowes stores there, William Lowes later on, now the bank. The building there is the former farmhouse. The Crown Hotel is still there. But the medieval village, the earlier village is removed, and this shopping centre put in its place. You'd hope today it would be they would take more account of the original village and put this behind those shops, but this was how it was done in the 70s. Of course, many of the shops in Wickham and Dunstan and Swalwell today, and even Bladen, are really challenged by the latest innovation of shopping, the Metro Centre, this huge mall, American-style mall, which provides great employment for people, but also is detrimental to many of the shops that try to exist in the surrounding villages. But the Metro Centre continues to grow and grow, building upon the former ash settlement beds of the power station. But this is very much a great employer in the area now, service industries. So what are the people who owned all of this industry? Well, they could afford to live in very, very grand houses. So I've mentioned the Liddles of Ravensworth, the Ravensworth Castle, medieval castle rebuilt by John Nash, the Prince Regent's architect, showing off the wealth and prestige of the Liddles. The Claverings, I mentioned James Clavering there in the Wagon Way at Swalwell. He could afford to rebuild his house, Axwell Hall, by James Payne, a national architect. The Bowes family of Gibbside created a tremendous pleasure gardens and grounds around their Jacobean house, never really got around to rebuilding the house, spent so much money on the grounds. And then Dunstan Hill, for the Carrs and later the Carr Ellisons, Newcastle family merchants trading all over the world from this house in Wickham Parish. And we find within Wickham itself that much of the land that was common land was the village green is taken over to form miniature estates by 1800. So I've mentioned the medieval. There's the church there. We have the rectory, the medieval rectory, back where it is now. The rectory is back there again. The rector of Wickham in 1713 decided he wanted a new rectory. So Reverend Tomlinson built a new rectory on the glebe land over here, surrounded by gardens. The whole of the south side of the village, where I showed that line, where that line of houses would have been, disappeared into a house for the Rawling family of Wickham Hall, later the Chase. Wickham Lodge estate over here, the home of the Barrises and then the Williamsons, and they owned land on both sides of Wickham Highway. Dockendale Hall, again owned by the Liddles, and Jasper Harrison, a Newcastle lawyer, created a mini estate, Wickham Park, which is still there. And then over on the very western edge of the village, we have the Hermitage estate, which now the very beautiful gardens, created by the late David Peacock and his colleagues. But an example of other people getting in on this, because the land in Wickham was so valuable, you have the Marquess of Bute buying land in Wickham Parish. And in Dunstan, there was a 17th century building called Bute Hall that survived until the 20th century as a shooting lodge for the Earl of Bute, for the Marquess of Bute rather, when he came here. But they were buying land in Wickham because it brought with it mineral rights for the coal, with means to aggrandize themselves. And so you also have not just the wealthy landowners buying land here, but also the professionals who work with them. So people like the Askew's doctors who bought the rectory after Tomlinson moved out. The Rawlings were coal borers, making lots of money by geologists identifying where coal seams were for the great families. The Barrises coal mining, agricultural farming, brewing over here, Taylor of the Hermitage brewing as well. And these people moved into Wickham because it was close enough to Newcastle, but it was this rural ideal, what Hutchinson called a fine and airy place in his History of Durham at the end of the 18th century. And they very quickly subsumed lots of the public land into private gardens. And we see some of these houses around: Greenhill House next to the village green, Rose Villa, Salisbury House, the Rectory here, Wickham Lodge, Wickham Park, the Hermitage, the House, the Chase, formerly Wickham Hall. So the Rectory, bought by Dr. Askew at a time when to be a doctor you had to go and be trained in Edinburgh or on the continent, and you could only really you charged a fee that could only be afforded by the very wealthiest people in society. Askew owned 4 country estates by the time of his death, including this one in Wickham, now back as the Rectory again after the First World War. Reverend Tomlinson built a very grand house in 1713, now the doctor's surgery, the health centre, but it was surrounded by gardens. He turned the glebe land into gardens for himself to impress his visitors. The Chase, or Wickham House, in the park, constructed on what had been that whole southern side of the village street, overlooking the village green and the church. Very fine house of about 1740 as well. The Rawlings, coal boring experts, when they left it to the Leetons, who were state stewards at Gibbside, but they had income from brewing and agriculture and mining as well. Wickham Lodge is still there. Very fine house, beautiful house, by the barristers who were farmers, owned a huge run of land up to Sunnyside Road and Broome Corner. And so they were getting what's called wayleave payments from every wagon that went across their land. And with that, they used that to build a very fine house in a very prominent position as people come into Wickham. And a lawyer, Jasper Harrison, ideally placed to get in on business deals, and he built himself a very fine house, still there, Wickham Park. And the Taylors owned the brewery down at Swarwell, but they themselves lived in this fine and airy situation on top of the hill at Wickham with their very fine garden. So we are left with some of these very grand houses of the very wealthy people who made money from industry and agriculture in Wickham Parish. And then we're also left with the houses of many of the workers. And that begins with individual stone houses, where there's a good group at the east end of Wickham Village, opposite the police station. Very well built houses and pan-tile roofs in the Durham tradition. At the opposite end, we have the colliery housing that I mentioned for Axel Park Colliery, rows and rows of terraces named possibly after the children of the colliery owner, Edith, Eleanor, George, William, and James streets over here. When Watergate Colliery opened in the 1920s, a new housing estate was laid out in the characteristic yellow brick extracted from the colliery for the miners' families there, again with public space in front. If we go to Marley Hill, nothing is left of the colliery, but we have the colliery rows. The rows of the houses where this mining community lived are still there. Sometimes the colliery history revives itself, so we find evidence of former coal mines. This one behind Fellside Road during the construction of Kestrel Mews in 1997. To house these workers, of course, individual land wasn't available for individual houses in many cases. So we see the development of Tyneside Flats. A good example here, Park Terrace in Swarwell, running down the hillside as they do on the opposite side of the river as well. So 2 families could be accommodated on the footprint of one house, one family upstairs, one family downstairs. And then in the 1930s, after the First World War, as the industries continued to expand on Tyneside, more and more housing was built in Wickham Parish. So we have the estate, Lenin Terrace, Marks Terrace, the Grove laid out, Arthur Holmes Avenue, George Lansbury, road laid out off Broom Lane in Wickham for industrial families as well. The area just north of Wickham Frontage, Viola Terrace and others laid out there. The Hillcrest estate at Lobley Hill, and of course bungalows for the more well-to-do, what were called suburban villas, laid out along Cornwall Road in Wickham. And then after the Second World War, that need to provide more and more housing exploded over Wickham Parish, and we see big estates like Broadway, the Grange Estate, the Fellside Estate, and again, very well-to-do houses on Cornwall Road, almost like a millionaire's row, being constructed right up to the present day, as we try and accommodate more and more people for the industries of Tyneside today. We've even had some quite innovative forms of housing. Dunstan Rocket, who'd have thought when this was built in the 1970s that the Victorian housing at its foot would outlive it. I don't think that was ever the intention. I think we were all supposed to be living in these sky palaces, as they were thought of at the time. And all of this terraced housing was supposed to disappear. Of course, it didn't quite work out that way, did it? And it actually turned out that families were better off in the terraced housing and in semi-detached housing than in any of these enormous structures. But you get a sense from this photograph by John Medcalf, looking from behind the Corp in Wickham, of just the dominating effect of the rocket upon the Tyneside landscape. And of course, you've got the gas holders at Thames, you've got the Tyne Bridge there, some of the other tower blocks at Elsick, and just visible there, Newcastle Civic Centre. So housing is there, both the very wealthy housing, much of it now turned into apartments or other uses like the doctor's surgery, but we still have much of the housing associated with Tyneside industry within Wickham Parish. But at the core, we still have where we began with the Bolden Book, two reminders of the very, very long history of Wickham Parish, the parish church and the village green, this fine and airy place within the heart of Tyneside. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Richard. That was so interesting, and we've got some really nice comments and questions on the Facebook comments box already. If anyone else has got any questions they'd like to ask or anything they'd like to share, then do please put your comments in the box, and Richard and I will discuss. So first of all, we've got a couple of comments from Lee. He says, never noticed these bell pit depressions. We were talking about the sort of saucer-shaped depressions. Where is the best place to see one?
Some of them are actually listed. The ones south of Dunstan Hill are listed, but actually I think probably the best place is the Banky Fields, if you know, going down sort of north of Wickham towards Market Lane. They are quite visible there in low light. So if you're on the other side of Wickham up towards Sunnyside, Lottie's Wood, there was one excavated by our friends in Sunnyside History Society, and they put a plaque there with a bench next to it as well. But they really are all over. You know, the image I showed of the shaft, the mine shaft at Kestrel Mews was almost certainly a bell pit as well. That because these were just covered over with rubbish and left. There was no attempt to fill them in. So unfortunately, lots of people fell into them in the dark, and they do keep opening up at times.
That's lovely. So when you mean low light, do you mean sort of like maybe later on in the evening when the light's at an angle?
Yeah, when you catch the sun at an angle, yes.
Great. Okay, we'll have to go and have a look and see. And he's also said, were the collieries linked by tunnels?
Well, the collieries underground, yes, they were in by the 20th century were certainly linked. So, for example, Axwell Park Colliery was later connected with collieries that were down at Swalwell, but also with Watergate Colliery as well. So, and there was a colliery on the what's now the Derwent Walk over towards Hollandside, which was a drift mine, and that was later connected with Watergate Colliery as well. So underground, you have these vast tunnel networks. I mean, the whole of Wickham is held up on pit props, from several centuries. But certainly there are records of huge payments for Watergate Colliery and Axwell Park Colliery to install new machinery to move people hundreds of yards underground to get to the coal face. So eventually the tunnels did connect with one another. Yes.
Wow, that's really interesting. And then he goes on to say, I guess if I was around then, I'd have worked in one of Crowley Ironworks, coal mine or stades, or agriculture.
Pretty much, these were big employers, and they needed the labor. So this is where people would naturally go to work.
Yeah, and it's a very different time now, isn't it? When we ask the kids, don't we? Well, what do you want to be when you grow up? And they say all sorts, don't they? But I guess people's ideas would have been very much influenced by where they were born and where they lived in terms of what sort of employment opportunities they'd have.
I think that's very much so. Now, my grandfather came to Wickham in 1925 with his father, who was his family moved to Wickham from Crook to work at Watergate Colliery. And his father, basically, when he got to the age of 14, gave him a choice, find a job, another job in 2 weeks, or you're down the pit. And he found another job in Newcastle, so he never went down the pit. But that was very limited window to find anything else. Otherwise, you're sort of born into the colliery, or the docks, or the ironworks. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you mentioned brewing as quite a big industry as well. As was that another big employer?
Not such a big employer, because people engaged in brewing small scale. Everybody drank beer, of course, because the water was so polluted. So people would drink small beer, and lots of people would just brew their own. The brewing that went on did continue at Swarwell for some time, but really very quickly moved to the barristers moved their brewery from Wickham Lodge, where they began, out to a bigger brewery at Gateshead. But certainly lots of people, because they've got agriculture, they've got the means to produce barley, to produce crops that can be used for brewing. So it's a sort of useful byproduct that everybody's going to need to drink, and it's another way of making money.
Great. Okay, we've got a comment from Michael. Thank you. That was fascinating. I was born in Dunstan and brought up in Wickham, and remember, oh, hang on a minute, where's it gone? And remember many of the places you mentioned from my childhood. And I guess that's the thing, isn't it? Those pictures that you showed. What was the name of the photographer? From
Jack Metcalf.
Yes. I mean, those photographs really wasn't that long ago, but it's completely transformed.
That's the amazing. There's about 100 photographs that we have that he left us in is left to his friend, and his friend gave them to Wickham History Society. But they just capture the area around Wickham at that point in time where the coal mining had finished in 1984. If you think about the date, the miners' strike and things, so the collieries are closing, and the associated industries that rely upon the coal are dying as well. And he was there just to capture this, the last view of these things, that's within my living memory. I remember Derwenhof Coke Works and Norwood Coke Works and things like that as a child. But he managed to capture those, and so much of that has just completely disappeared now. If you go to Watergate Park, you would never guess, or Derwenhof Park. Derwenhof Park, the filth that was there with the coke works, you would never imagine it was there. Such a good job has been done in cleaning it up and turning it into somewhere that people want to go.
That's true. I mean, and cleaning all the way along the riverside as well. Yeah. I mean, the whole of the River Tyne. Well, there are still bits that haven't been decontaminated, but so much of it has, and it's provided such lovely places for us to go for our daily walks.
Absolutely.
Over the last few months. And so we've got Michael asking, are these photographs available online?
The Metcalf ones are not. I do show them fairly regularly for talks, but we haven't got them all online yet. No, some of them are, some of them aren't. But it's just sort of a big task to sort of digitize them all and make them available. But some of the other photographs I've shown tonight, they are from people like Beamish and Gateshead Libraries, who gave us a lot of the photographs to go in the book we did on Wickham history a couple of years ago. So there's more and more going online, yes, and there's some really good websites. There's a very good website for Dunstan history by I think Ken, he's called. If you just Google Dunstan history, you'll find an excellent site there. Swarwell have got Sunnyside have got a very good website. So I'll put some on the Wickham website as well. And just things on Facebook like, Wickham past and present and things. People have some great treasures in their houses. And you sort of think, why have I never seen that photograph before when it suddenly pops up on Facebook, so this is the beauty of things being available now. You can see much more of what people have got.
Yeah, we can share things. So you've talked about a couple of different places as well during the course of the talk. You've shown pictures from Rydale Folk Museum and Durham Mining Museum. And now that we're able to go out a little bit and go to some of these places, is there any particular museums that you'd recommend to go and get an idea about how, maybe the industrial kind of take off and then decline?
Well, I think the obvious one is Beamish, which, if you think about it, you have the Pockley farm, so what I said about agriculture, small farm buildings, surrounded by fields. You've got the fact that a wagonway railway runs through it,
yes.
Which is what I said about coal being more important to come through there. And then you've got the farm as well, the other farm, giving you sort of that continuing view of agriculture into the 20th century. And of course, the town itself is, imagine sort of what I showed you, the tithe map of Wickham in 1842, where there was mostly fields.
Mm-hmm.
At that time, there was no such place as Stanley. There was no concert. Huge numbers of settlements that we just sort of drive through today didn't exist. I think I showed Marley Hill, Sunnyside. Again, Marley Hill was a couple of houses, because the colony wasn't there. So I think the town is good, Beamish, because it gives you that sort of sense of insularity and what you were saying, Lucy, about almost being born into expectation of what job you would do. If you looked around the town, you could be a printer, you could work in the coal mine, you might get a job in the garage, but it was going to be, or the railway, but basically that was it, or the co-op, of course, you could get a job in one of the shops. So I just don't find Beamish fascinating, but if you're going further afield, the Rydale Folk Museum is really good day out. And some of the other museums, small ones like Tanfield Railway. Again, if you want to look at railways in the raw, there you've got the original one. So I hope people will support all of these places as we're allowed to go out and see them again.
Yes, I'd love a trip onto Tanfield Railway. I've been to the Arch many times, but I've always missed the train. But yes, I'm fascinated by the way that the railways and those wagonways will have established the engineering necessary for all of the infrastructure that came along.
I think that is one of the greatest inventions that came about in Britain, but particularly that need on Tyneside for moving coal. And you think today, how many millions, if not billions, of journeys are made every day by that idea of pulling a vehicle along tracks with a locomotive, with an engine. So what began as a means to solve a particular problem in the Tyneside coal industry and else, other industries elsewhere, has revolutionized how people see the world, how they got across America, how they got across Australia, India, places like that. Quite staggering, really.
Yeah, and opens up so many possibilities so that we can ask our kids what job they want when they grow up.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the idea of getting to London in 2.5 hours, from Newcastle would have just been like going to the moon for people in the 19th century, wouldn't it?
Yeah. And so we've got a comment from David. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. And Oh, I'm just having a little look. Yes, Lee. Thanks for all your comments, Lee. We put some really good questions in there. Great talk. Thanks, Richard. So I think we've gone through the questions that we've had. Alan asked if he'll be able to catch up later. Absolutely. Anybody who wants to catch up later will be able to look at it on the Facebook page, but we'll also be putting it on our YouTube channel as well. So I think we've got all of those. I just wanted to go back a little bit to the beginning of the talk, maybe to finish us off. Can you tell us anything more about the Bolden book? Because obviously you hear about the Doomsday book, but that was from about the same time before?
The Doomsday book was a century before, 1086, and that was done for King William the Conqueror. Again, it was a tax document, essentially. But at the time, it was uncertain which country Durham and Northumberland and Cumberland belonged to. The Scots claimed it. You know, the area north of the River Tweed, Lothian, is the northern part of the Anglo-Saxon, the English kingdom of Northumbria, which the Scots occupied in 1018. And so there was still this dispute that the Scots were trying to take the rest of Northumbria as well, down to the River Tees. So, you know, in the 1170s, which is quite a reason why I think the Bolden book comes about a decade later. The 1170s, you have William the Lion of Scotland trying to occupy Northumberland and part of Durham, and is defeated at Alnwick, having failed to capture Newcastle and Prudhoe. And I think it's that point that the King of England, Henry II, says to the Bishop of Durham, "You're supposed to be in charge there. I want to know what is up there, because I've just had to send an army there to kick the Scots out again. So I want to know what is up there and what you own in my name." So
tell me it was worth it.
Tell me it was worth it, basically. Yes, I think it's closely linked with the defeat of William the Lion's attempts to annex Northumberland and Durham to Scotland. And so it's the same idea, but it's very much the bishop is the lord of the manor. But I suspect that standing behind the bishop very closely is King Henry II saying, you're paying for any future armies. sort of thing. So it's really the same kind of thing. They went from village to village, and they identified how many heads of families there were, what the legal responsibilities were, so how they held their land, how much land they held, how many animals they had, and what they owed in terms of service, like this thing about carrying baggage and stuff, because the bishop owns land all around the northeast. He wants his tenants to basically be his pack horses for him. People are cheaper than horses. So, it's that kind of world, really. So
it sounds pretty grueling, actually. I mean, how long did that go on for? Because we're talking about that, and then you're moving into talking about the sort of elite ownership of Wickham Village at the beginning of the 19th century. So how long is the bishops and the sort of feudal system going on for?
Until probably about the 16th century. Say Henry VIII did a great deal to weaken the power of the secular aristocracy and appoint royal officials who were sent from London, who had no kind of following in the north of England, so they could be loyal to him alone. And Queen Elizabeth, particularly after the rebellion of the Earls of Northumberland and Westmoreland, I think sort of thinks, right, well, I really want to take much more control here. And because Henry VIII had weakened the church by bringing it under royal control in the 1530s and closing down the monasteries, but Elizabeth still saw that the bishops had a lot of land, and in Durham that meant they had the coal mines as well. And I think she saw the way to make a lot of money by getting Newcastle businessmen essentially to take over the running of the coal mines rather than the bishop. But the bishop's powers, the judicial powers lasted till 1835. The Bishop of Durham had his own courts until 1835.
Wow.
And until, and the other incredible thing is, in terms of representation in Parliament, the Bishop of Durham was the only person in Durham who sat in Parliament until 1666. Then there were 2 MPs for Durham and 2 for the county, for Durham City, all of whom were really controlled by the bishop. So from 1666 until 1836, there were only 5 men who represented Durham in Parliament. And it's only 1836 that places like Gateshead, Sunderland, Hartlepool, these major industrial towns get some kind of representation in Parliament, and that's when the bishop's powers, the last of his powers, are really sort of taken away from him. So it lasts that long, it's within what 170, 190 years, less than 200 years ago, that they had all of these sort of regal powers.
Wow, that's so interesting. Well, thank you so much, Richard. I'll just have one last little check for any more questions before we wrap it up for the evening. Where are we? Michael, wonderful, thank you. You were even more interesting than football, which I'm also watching out of the corner of my eye. England are winning, by the way. Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you, everybody, for all of your comments. It's been really nice to hear all of your different perspectives. Yeah. And
Lucy, could I just interrupt you?
Yeah.
I just wanted to say thank you to you and your colleagues for putting on these talks. I've enjoyed so many of them, and I'm sure many other people have as well. I know members of Wickham History have as well. So I just want to say publicly a big thank you to you and your colleagues for doing this, because it's been wonderful. And I hope some ways found of continuing these for the future, whether they're in person or Zoomed as well, doing kind of both if we can.
Yes.
But thank you for giving up your evenings and other things to sort of work on this for everybody's benefit as well.
Oh, Richard, thank you so much. That's really lovely of you to say that. And it has been a really enjoyable, well, we've been doing these live Q&As since January, and I think it's just been very handy to have something going on that people can join in with, even though we've gone through, lockdown number 3 and all this. We are planning to have an in-person local history festival soon. So just cross your fingers, everybody. I don't know what else I can say really at this stage. Everything's still, very difficult to make plans, but we're hoping that we'll be able to do some activities in person in the autumn.
That'd be great.
And I should probably mention the Heritage Lottery Fund as well, who has been who's made all of these kind of activities possible, so that we can show you all our new and refurbished Gateshead archive, and which is now open, and you can come in and you can look at photographs, you can look at maps, there's all sorts of materials that you can come in and look at the archive. And there are photographs and materials online as well, if you just look at gatesheadlocalstudies.com. So yes, thanks, Richard. Have a lovely rest of your evening. And hopefully we'll see you in the autumn.